If you're a fan of classic whodunit style mysteries, then today's case is for you. I'm not exaggerating when I say this story has everything. A prominent and respected victim, small-town intrigue, and a whole cast of strange and suspicious characters, each seemingly with something to gain. Now, normally I would probably compare this story to something out of an Agatha Christie novel, but I actually think today's case is more like the movie Knives Out. Because not only does almost everyone in this story arguably have a motive, but every time it seems like things are finally settling down, there's another twist. As always, my name is Nigel, I run this channel with my good friend Luke, and welcome back to Crime Zone. A reminder, if you do find today's video interesting and informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more true crime stories told with a mysterious and suspenseful vibe. Also, I know this one is very long, but settle in, because I do think it's worth it. With that out of the way, let's dive in. At the start of 2003, things couldn't have been going better for Anna Mae Branson. At 85 years old, she had achieved basically everything she'd ever wanted. She was a wealthy and successful businesswoman, she had a very active and fulfilling social circle, and she was one of the most respected and well-known people in her entire community. Anna Mae, who most people knew as either Miss Anne or simply Anne, had led a very interesting and eventful life. Honestly, her background almost sounds like something that could have been pulled from a character in a classic book or movie. While we couldn't find much information about Anne's early years, we know that she was born in Hopkins County, Kentucky in 1917. She was the oldest of the 5 children in her tightly knit family, and she spent pretty much her whole life in and around the city of Madisonville. What we also know is that after finishing school, Anne married her high school sweetheart, a man named Carol Branson. And it's here where things become a lot clearer. Because neither Anne nor Carol came from money, the first few years of married life for them was tough. It was also the middle of the Great Depression, so you can imagine what that must have been like, particularly in a state like Kentucky. But the two of them were hard workers, especially Anne, who was always willing to take on new opportunities. Case in point, when the Second World War came around, Anne was one of the many women who joined the workforce to help replace the men who had gone to fight overseas. She took a position in a factory building fighter planes, but it was when the war was over that things really started to change for Anne and Carol. In 1950, after several more years of diligently working, they decided to invest their life savings into opening up a Dairy Queen location in the middle of Madisonville. The business was a massive success. In many ways, it became the spiritual center of the small city, a place where families would go, people would hang out, and where basically every local teenager had gone on a date at least once. Now, the Bransons' fortunes did not change overnight. It took many years of hard work, and for a long time, Anne and Carol lived in a small trailer behind their Dairy Queen on South Main Street. But by the time they sold the place in 1985, the couple had transformed their little ice cream shop into a multi-million-dollar business. I think most people would be thrilled to have this level of success, and the Bransons definitely spent time enjoying the fruits of their labor, particularly Carol, who had a ton of different hobbies, including painting, photography, metalworking, and playing bass in the country band he started. Anne had quite a few interests herself, especially gardening, but she also wanted to continue working. So after setting aside some of the money they'd made, she launched another business in real estate, buying, fixing up, and renting out old local properties. Sadly, Anne and Carol didn't have as much time together as they'd always imagined. In 1994, just 9 years after they sold the Dairy Queen, Carol passed away. While the Bransons never had any children, fortunately, Anne was far from alone. She was involved in all sorts of local clubs and organizations, and she had a social calendar that was busier than most people half her age. She was also still very active in the day-to-day operations of her real estate business, and now owned about 40 different properties. More than anything, though, Anne loved spending time with her family, especially her many nieces and nephews. She was like a second mother to a lot of them, and her house was always the gathering place for family events and holidays. By the way, Anne had long since moved out of that little trailer behind the Dairy Queen. Once she and Carol had become successful, they'd purchased one of the nicest homes in town right on Main Street. I should emphasize, though, that money was not the driving force in Anne's life. She definitely appreciated the things that being wealthy had given her. For instance, she really enjoyed looking nice and dressing up and had this impeccable wardrobe. People even used to joke that she was like the town movie star. But on a personal level, Anne was incredibly humble, particularly when it came to her accomplishments, and she also had a reputation for being very generous with her wealth. Of course, Anne's family benefited from this, but they weren't the only ones. For example, if Anne knew that one of her tenants was struggling, she'd give them breaks on rent, often for months at a time. She was similarly generous when it came to her church. Her house was right across the street, and she was one of the most active members of the congregation. Whenever Anne would give money, though, she always tried to do so in secret through her pastor, to the point that most of the people that she was helping apparently had no idea. Amazingly, even in her twilight years, Anne was still open to new experiences and was finding new things to be excited about. In fact, she'd even found love again. She'd met and started dating a retired eye surgeon from Evansville, Indiana, named Dr. Bob Fenneman, and recently, the two of them had actually gotten engaged. So yeah, you see what I mean. Anne had lived this incredible life, and she was showing no signs of slowing down. But while her life might have sounded like something out of a storybook, sadly, it would not have a storybook ending. Shortly before noon on January 13th, 2003, the Madisonville Police Department received a phone call. That call was from Dr. Bob, who said that he was concerned about his fiancée, Anne Branson. Bob explained that he'd been trying to reach Anne since the previous day, but he hadn't been able to get a hold of her. He was worried that she might have suffered some kind of accident or medical emergency. He'd actually driven down from Evansville to try and check on her himself, but he hadn't received an answer at the front door. He asked if police could stop by and conduct a welfare check of their own. When an officer was sent down to the residence, they found Bob standing outside, along with Anne's younger brother Earl, who had also just arrived. Bob had contacted Earl as well, hoping he might be able to help him get in since Anne's house was locked. Sure enough, Earl knew where there was a key hidden in the bushes, which they were able to use to open the front door. Upon heading inside, Bob, Earl, and the Madisonville police officer all began calling out for Anne, but they didn't get a response. They split up to search the place faster, and when they did, it wasn't long before one of them made a devastating discovery. As Bob and the Madisonville officer were covering the main and second floors of the house, Earl decided to go down into the basement. Almost immediately after opening the door that led down there, he started yelling for help. Earl had found Anne lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs. Sadly, there was nothing anyone could do. She was dead. Now, for a split second, it looked like maybe Anne had fallen, but it soon became apparent that that was not the case. Upon actually heading into the basement and seeing what was down there, it was clear that this was a crime scene. Anne was sprawled out on her stomach, lying just past the base of the stairs, and she was absolutely covered in blood and horrific injuries. She had what appeared to be stab wounds all over her body, to her face, her neck, her forearms, her back, almost everywhere. Arguably the worst injuries, though, were the ones to Anne's head. She'd suffered repeated blows that were so vicious and forceful that her head had actually changed its shape. In other words, this was a brutal murder, one that only became more chilling when detectives arrived and began taking a closer look at the whole scene. In addition to numerous defensive wounds, there were claw marks on a freezer right next to Anne's body, suggesting that she had fought hard with her attacker and struggled right up until her final moments. Further disturbing details would be revealed during a subsequent autopsy. The medical examiner determined that Anne had 97 stabbing injuries. What had actually killed her, though, were the blows to her head. Anne had been hit at least 7 times, resulting in massive damage, particularly to the back of her skull. Based on the wounds, the ME concluded that the attack on Anne had likely started from behind, and that many of the stabbing injuries had been inflicted after she was already dead. As for what had caused these wounds, the medical examiner said they couldn't be sure, but it was possible 2 different weapons had been used in the killing. The autopsy was able to offer more definitive information when it came to the timing of the murder, though. The examination revealed that Anne had eaten shortly before her death, and there was a pot of half-finished food on her stove upstairs. Based on this, and the fact that Anne had been seen at her regular Sunday evening church service the previous night, investigators concluded that she'd likely been killed shortly after returning home, sometime between 7 and 7:30 p.m. This was further backed up by the fact that Anne's purse and jacket were draped over a chair by her dining room table, the way she would have casually set them down after walking into the house. While this was all very useful information in determining how and when the crime had happened, it quickly became clear to detectives that figuring out who had done this, and more importantly why, was not going to be as straightforward. For starters, despite how disturbing the basement crime scene was, it offered very little in terms of additional clues. All of the blood there was later determined to belong to Anne, and ultimately no useful physical evidence was really recovered, something authorities attributed to the killer partially cleaning up before fleeing. Similarly, there were no eyewitnesses to the crime. No one had seen anything out of the ordinary around the time of the murder. The only exception was a couple of people who claimed that they'd seen a black pickup truck outside Anne's house that night, but they couldn't really give any specifics beyond that. On top of this, much like Anne's jacket and purse, nothing inside her home appeared to be out of place. Nothing seemed to be missing either, even though there were plenty of valuables worth stealing if that were the killer's motive, including a large amount of jewelry. But even Anne's 3-carat diamond engagement ring was still on her finger when she was found, meaning that this almost certainly was not a robbery. Of course, that left a much more unsettling possibility, that this was personal. But if that were true, who could have possibly wanted Anne Branson dead? I mean, she was one of the most beloved people in town, right? Well, after thoroughly examining the crime scene, detectives were confident about one thing. Whoever was responsible for this had to be someone that Anne was very familiar with. You might be wondering, how could police have already determined that the killer was someone close to Anne? Well, there were actually several things pointing in this direction. There was the lack of forced entry at the scene, the fact that this wasn't a robbery, and let's not forget the brutality of the crime itself, which seemed to suggest that there was intense emotion behind this. But one of the biggest reasons authorities became convinced early on that this had to be someone Anne knew well was both simple and kind of unusual. Remember when I told you that Anne really liked to dress up and look her best? Well, part of that was wearing wigs. In addition to her large wardrobe of clothes and shoes, she also had a sizable collection of wigs, and she always wore one when she was going out or expecting company. But Anne was not wearing a wig at the time of the murder. To police, this meant that whoever the killer was, they were probably someone Anne felt pretty comfortable around. After coming to this realization, authorities turned their attention towards anyone in Anne's inner circle that might have had a motive. And they began with the person who had first alerted them to all of this, her fiancé, Dr. Bob. I mentioned earlier that Anne and Bob had recently gotten engaged. In case it wasn't clear, he was the one who gave her that 3-carat diamond ring. Well, according to some of Anne's family members, the details of how their arrangement was going to work hadn't really been sorted out yet, and Anne was kind of feeling hesitant. She was happy about the engagement, and she'd enthusiastically said yes, but she also wanted to protect everything she'd worked so hard for. As a result, there were talks of a prenuptial agreement, and police wondered if maybe Bob had gotten angry with Anne during an argument over money, and things had spiraled out of control. However, during questioning, Bob was very forthcoming. He offered a detailed accounting of his whereabouts in the lead up to the crime, stating he'd last seen Anne 2 days earlier, so Saturday, January 11th. Bob said that Anne had come to Evansville and the two of them went out dancing. Afterwards, Anne went back home, and at the time, things seemed totally normal. The following day, Bob had called Anne, but he hadn't tried to reach out until later that evening because he knew Anne spent a lot of time at church on Sundays. When she never picked up or got back to him, he started to get concerned. By the next morning, he was worried enough that he decided to drive down to Anne's house before ultimately contacting police. When investigators looked into Bob's alibi, the whole thing checked out. Crucially, his phone records placed him at home during that 7 to 7:30 p.m. timeframe on January 12th, when the murder took place, and he also appeared genuinely heartbroken by what had happened to Anne. So yeah, it clearly wasn't Bob, but police still thought they were on the right track in terms of the kinds of suspects they were looking at. Specifically, after hearing more about Anne's reputation for generosity, they wondered if this might have been related to her murder. And those suspicions only grew when they were approached by a woman named Judy Harvey. Judy was Ann's longtime cleaning lady, and as investigators soon learned, she had quite a bit to say. After coming in for a formal interview, Judy almost immediately threw out the names of two men, each of whom she claimed easily could have been the killer. Their names were Clyde Wayne Shelton and Robert Prince. We'll start with Robert Prince.
I was her housekeeper, and I also took care of her rental properties and that.
Okay. You have an opinion about who's responsible for her death, don't you?
Yes, I do.
And who was that?
She have a renter on Legion Drive that is about $2,000 or better behind on rent. He got laid off. He was just kind of freaky acting, really.
Okay.
As you just heard, Robert was one of Ann's tenants, and he had a reputation for unusual behavior. In fact, Judy wasn't even the first person to bring him up. A couple of Ann's family members had already approached police with their own concerns about Robert, saying that he was constantly causing problems for Ann and would call her with all sorts of bizarre complaints. According to Ann's family, these situations could get pretty ridiculous. For instance, not long before the murder, Robert had called Ann during the middle of the night, asking her to come over and chase a ghost out of his attic. It probably goes without saying, Robert was not in the greatest shape, mentally speaking, and Ann knew that. He also had a history of emotional instability and was known for being volatile and lashing out. Now, Ann had tried to help Robert, but at the time of her death, he was facing eviction. It wasn't really about the money. As I said, Ann was pretty understanding with people when it came to rent, but her other tenants had started complaining about Robert as well, so Ann knew she was probably going to have to kick him out. Needless to say, this certainly seemed like it could have been a potential motive, and things got even more interesting for investigators when they learned that Robert Prince had a criminal record, a record that included some pretty violent offenses.
Could you state your name and Robert Welwood's case? This is not a natural death investigation. It was Miss Branson was murdered. How? Well, it was nice, though.
Did you hear any beefs? People that we've talked to said that an eviction might be coming.
Yeah, I have no reason to lie to you people, man. I haven't done the
lies now could cost you your life because this crime is of the nature that somebody could make stuff help.
I have nothing to hide. I didn't kill anyone.
Okay.
I'm not no angel. I did 6 years in prison. Okay.
Despite Robert's denials, there was one other reason police were interested in him. You see, he owned a black pickup truck that matched the description of the one those witnesses said they'd seen outside Ann's house on the night of the murder. So yeah, that was Robert Prince. The other man Judy Harvey named was Wayne Shelton. Like Robert, Wayne also had a criminal history, but his was nowhere near as serious. He'd had quite a few run-ins with the law, but they were mostly related to drinking. Aside from a robbery conviction, most of his arrests were for things like bar fights and DUIs. But this was not the reason that Wayne became a person of interest. The reason he caught the attention of police was because he worked for Ann as a handyman. And according to Judy, Wayne not only had access to Ann's property, he was borrowing money from her all the time without ever paying it back.
Wayne said about every Sunday night, I would go by there, he said 99.30 to ask her for some money. His opinion was, well, hell, she's got money. And I told him, I said, Wayne, I said, you're ripping her off like crazy.
When Wayne was brought in for an interview, he likewise denied having anything to do with Ann's murder. But he was also very candid with detectives. He said he had taken money from Ann, though he claimed he'd always intended to pay it back, and he was upfront about his criminal history. He was similarly transparent about the fact that he didn't have a great alibi, though he insisted he was at home at the time of the murder.
Did you ever borrow any money from her? Did you pay her back on what you owed?
Sunday night, about 9:30. Are you sure you were at home?
Yeah.
Did you kill Anna Branson?
Sure. Killing anybody. Killing him. You ever been in trouble going past? Well, yeah. What kind of trouble was that? She robbed her. Outside that, I mean, by the day you right. Which I don't even drink anymore.
Even though Wayne was upfront with investigators, it was easy to see that there was a potential motive here. Perhaps Anne had cut him off, or had wanted him to start paying back the money he'd borrowed from her, and this had led to some sort of altercation. At this point, it seemed like authorities were in a good place. They had two equally viable-looking suspects, and it appeared that all they needed to do now was start digging a little deeper. But this is where the case took its first couple of strange turns, starting with both Robert Prince and Wayne Shelton being ruled out. This happened in a weirdly similar way when detectives were put in contact with doctors for the two men. Just to be clear, these were different doctors. They didn't have the same doctor or anything. But what authorities were told was effectively the same thing. Neither Robert nor Wayne was physically capable of committing this crime. In Robert's case, he'd had surgery on the elbow of his dominant arm just days before the murder. In fact, you can watch detectives spotting the injury in real time during his interview.
That's a heck of an injury you got on your elbow.
It's had surgery Thursday.
They just what's wrong with it?
As a result of the surgery, Robert had stitches and staples around the area where the procedure had happened, and doctors assured police that he would have totally messed these up if he'd committed an attack like this, which would have been very obvious. With Wayne Shelton, the situation was even more dire. You see, Wayne hadn't just quit drinking to turn his life around, he had a severe heart condition. His doctor said that if Wayne had exerted himself anywhere close to the level that would have been involved in committing such a violent murder, he almost certainly would have suffered a massive heart attack. Obviously, this was not great news for detectives, but as I said, there were a couple of strange turns that happened here, and the other part of this concerned Judy Harvey. You see, the more police spoke to Judy, the more they realized she was not a reliable witness. While some of the stuff she had told them was true, it became more and more clear as detectives followed up on her information that a good chunk of the stuff she was saying just was completely fabricated. Of course, this begged the question, why was Judy lying to police? Did she honestly think she was being helpful, or was there something more sinister going on? Judy appeared to have a solid alibi, and there was nothing directly linking her to Anne's murder. But she was also strangely insistent that Wayne Shelton in particular had something to do with the crime. For the moment, detectives weren't really sure what to make of this, but for good measure, they went back to Judy and they basically told her, if you keep making stuff up, we're going to have to charge you for interfering in our investigation.
Judy, to be honest with you, the things that you brought to the family's attention, that totally hinders our investigation. We can't have this continue, okay?
Okay.
Even though all of this was a bit of a detour, it wasn't necessarily a waste of time. The people investigators had looked into were all legitimate people of interest in their own way, and detectives remained convinced that their central theory was still valid, that Anne's killer was someone close to her. With the obvious suspects, so to speak, out of the way though, police now really only had one other direction to turn. And that meant having some uncomfortable conversations with the members of Anne's family. On January 18th, 2003, so 5 days after Anne Branson was found brutally murdered in her own home, a funeral was held for her. The service was at the First Baptist Church, just across the street from Anne's house, the place where she had spent so much of her time and had helped countless people in the community. To say that Anne's death was a shock would be an enormous understatement. People didn't want to believe that something this horrifying could happen in their little city, especially to someone like Anne, who, as far as anyone knew, didn't have an enemy in the world. Unfortunately, because of the lack of answers, it didn't take long for the collective sense of disbelief to be replaced by fear and anger, particularly after some of the disturbing details of the murder were reported in the local papers. Rumors started to run rampant across Madisonville, and though there was often nothing at all behind them, the consequences were very real. More than one person had their lives temporarily ruined after they were falsely accused of being the killer. One guy, Monty Crawford, was almost run out of town after someone made up a story about hearing over a police scanner that he'd been arrested. Not only did Monty's business take a huge hit because of this, people were literally going up to his daughters at school and harassing them, asking how they could stand to live with a murderer. To be clear, Monty had nothing to do with the crime. He was never even a suspect. This becomes even more ridiculous when you know that behind the scenes, police had entirely shifted their focus to members of Anne's own family. In the immediate aftermath of the crime, everyone had initially come together. They'd been especially concerned about Earl, who had actually witnessed the awful scene, and they'd all kind of rallied around to comfort and support him. But by the day of the funeral, things had shifted. The family was still devastated by what had happened, but on the flip side, they now knew that they were all suspects. So it created a strange situation where everyone was grieving, but they were also kind of looking around knowing that one of the people there was probably Ann's killer. It was around this time that police started bringing the family members in one by one for interviews, but they paid special attention to Ann's nieces and nephews. As I told you earlier, Ann was close with her nieces and nephews, and she'd been very generous with them in particular. There was quite the cast of characters here. To name a few, there was Jack, the retired federal agent, Brenda, the founder of a women's nonprofit focusing on domestic violence, and Tom, the pastor and fellow real estate investor. But pretty soon, there was one person that stood out from the crowd. His name was Russell Winstead, and he was actually the son of Ann's brother, Earl. Now, Russell's interview with police was fairly normal. Like all of his cousins and his other family members, he said that he couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt Ann. But pretty soon, investigators started to have their doubts. You see, as part of these interviews, everyone had agreed to take polygraph tests, and Russell, well, he absolutely bombed his.
Did you cause any of those injuries to Anna Mae Branson, causing her death?
No.
Did you cause any of those injuries to Anna Mae Branson in that basement?
No.
Did you strike any of those blows to Anna Mae Branson, causing her death?
No.
Well, one thing's for certain, you don't lie too well, because I can see it pretty evident on that.
Now, it's worth pointing out that polygraph tests are far from the gold standard in terms of evidence. There's a reason they're almost always inadmissible in court, after all. But after seeing Russell's results, detectives were definitely suspicious. The test indicated a high amount of deception, so they decided to grill Russell to see what else they could learn.
This is your aunt, Russell.
I know. This is a woman I love very much, and I would not harm for nothing, Scott. I don't care what this looks like. I don't. Please look at me.
Why? Why are you lying to me?
I don't care. I'm not. I would not harm her for nothing. I would not harm her for nothing. She's the one that would help me.
I see your eyes right now, Russell.
No, you don't.
Yes, I do.
I had nothing to do with this. Absolutely.
Have you explained away the lies?
As you just saw, Russell was adamant the police had it all wrong. He said that he loved his aunt and that she was one of the most important people in his life. He also provided an alibi, saying that he was at home at the time of the murder. Russell explained that on the night of January 12th, he and his family were also at church. Afterwards, he had dropped off his son from a previous relationship at his ex's place, but he'd spent the rest of the evening at home with his wife Terry and their other kids. When Terry was asked about this, she backed up Russell completely. She said that yes, she and Russell had briefly split up after the Sunday evening service, but he was definitely home at the time of the murder. Upon hearing that Russell was being looked at as a possible suspect, several other people similarly came to his defense. They said that the idea of Russell killing Ann was ridiculous. They had never even heard of Russell raising his voice, let alone hurting someone. He was a devoted father of 5 who worked hard at the local mine to support his family. On top of that, he was arguably Ann's favorite out of all of the nieces and nephews. It just didn't make sense. After learning all of this, police were once again at a dead end. Despite their suspicions, their most promising suspect had an alibi, and nothing else noteworthy jumped out during any of their other conversations. With nowhere really left to turn, there was a possibility that this case could go cold. Thankfully, that would not happen though, because just when things were at their most precarious, authorities would get a vital lead that would finally start to unravel this awful mystery. Several days into the investigation, Madisonville police received a call from a man named Jeff Hibbs. Jeff said that he wanted to come in and speak with someone because he was pretty sure he had information about the Ann Branson case. Sure enough, when he sat down with detectives for an interview, it wasn't long before he dropped an absolute bombshell on them.
I had a friend that had told me that he had borrowed some money from an aunt. It had to be paid back on Monday. And I bet she passed away on Sunday night or Monday morning or whatever.
Who is this friend?
Russell Winstead. Russell's co-worker of mine.
According to Jeff, a few days before the murder, Russell Winstead had asked him if he wanted to go to a riverboat casino in Evansville. Jeff stated he wasn't usually into that sort of thing, but he and Russell were friendly at work, and Russell had arranged for them to take a limo there and back, so he figured, why not? In Jeff's mind, this was going to be like a fun boys' night out, blowing off some steam sort of thing, especially because, Russell was supposed to be this upstanding Christian father and family man. But when they actually got there, Jeff was stunned by what he saw. Upon arriving at the casino, Russell whipped out a wad of cash and casually handed Jeff $100. He told him to go enjoy himself at the slot machines while he headed over to the card tables. As I said, Jeff wasn't much of a gambler, so pretty soon he got bored and went to check up on Russell and see what he was doing. To his astonishment, Russell was putting down thousands of dollars a hand on blackjack.
I couldn't believe the amount of cash he was laying on the tables. I'd say between $17,000 to $20,000. He kept thinking that this hand's gonna bring me back, this hand's gonna bring me back.
So yeah, it turned out that Russell was a degenerate gambler, and Jeff watched in total disbelief as he proceeded to lose everything he had, to the point that he eventually asked Jeff for the $100 back that he'd given him earlier. It was only after Russell literally lost every last penny that they finally left the casino. This is where things got really wild though, because Jeff said that on the way home, Russell was talking nonstop. He said that he was totally screwed because that money he'd lost, well, a good chunk of it didn't even belong to him. He borrowed about $9,700 of it from his aunt. Of course, she didn't know what that money was actually for. No one in his family did. His gambling was a complete secret. It got worse too, because according to Russell, he owed his aunt quite a bit more than that, and she was expecting to be paid back. In fact, in order to get that $9,700, he'd given her a check for $12,000 as a payment towards his other loans. He'd asked her not to cash the check until Monday, so January 13th, believing that he could gamble his way out of this hole. But now, Russell had nothing. He was convinced that when his aunt went to cash the check, his secret was going to be revealed. Jeff said that when he heard about Ann Branson's murder a few days later and realized it lined up exactly with what Russell had told him about the check, he knew he needed to come forward.
I watched him leave their money yet. He mentioned his point of bankruptcy. It was a long ride home from the Bows that night. He had a pistol with us. I thought it was easy. He took the pistol up to shoot himself. He said, I have to take my hands back Monday. And the way I understand it, the Anna Branson.
Understandably, police were stunned by Jeff's story. They had suspected Russell was lying to them, but this was on a whole other level. And things got even crazier when they started following up on some of the information Jeff had provided. Upon collecting surveillance footage from the numerous casinos that Russell frequented, they confirmed that his gambling was totally out of control. Russell would play hand after hand of cards night after night, often losing anywhere between $10,000 and $40,000 in a single session. Detectives also discovered that Russell's gambling addiction wasn't the only thing that didn't align with his squeaky clean family man image. It turned out he was more than a little friendly with some of the female staff at these casinos and had multiple girlfriends who he communicated with using a burner phone. A look at Russell's financial records provided further insights. Over the last few years alone, he'd gambled away hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he was now in a pretty desperate situation. For a long time, he had gotten away with quietly living this secret double life, but with his inability to pay his aunt back, his worlds were in danger of colliding. And if they did, Russell knew everything would be exposed. The gambling, the lying, the cheating, all of it. Now, you might be asking yourself, how did this prove Russell was involved in Ann's murder? Well, on its own, it didn't. Russell actually owed money to a lot of people, and you can obviously be a cheater without being a killer. But you remember that check for $12,000 that Jeff told detectives about? The one Russell gave Ann just days before the murder? Well, it was about to become a lot more important. During a follow-up search of Ann's house, authorities discovered a small notebook that they previously hadn't noticed because it was kind of tucked away. That notebook was a ledger, one that was very illuminating. You see, while Ann was generous with her wealth, she wasn't reckless. She kept meticulous records of every bit of money that came in and went out, as well as what was owed to her. Sure enough, when police looked at Ann's ledger, they saw that Russell owed her tens of thousands of dollars. Sources we came across in our research cited wildly different numbers, but the total debt was somewhere between $65,000 and $100,000. Not only was this apparently by far the largest amount that Russell owed to any one person, the ledger backed up the most critical details Jeff had provided to detectives. Days before her death, Ann had recorded giving Russell another loan for $9,700 and noted she'd received a check from him for $12,000. Here's the thing though. Remember how I said earlier that nothing was missing from Ann's house? Well, it turned out there was now one exception to that. No matter how hard police looked, they could not find that check for $12,000. A search of both Ann and Russell's financial records likewise proved that the check had never been deposited. But it definitely had been written, because it was also missing from Russell's checkbook. Every single other check in there could be accounted for, but check number 2658, it was gone. With this information in hand, detectives felt that they had finally pieced everything together. They suspected that when Russell asked Ann for that $9,700, she told him that she couldn't keep giving him money, at least not without some kind of good faith gesture he was actually serious about paying her back. So Russell had written the check for $12,000, fully aware that he didn't have the money in his account. In Russell's mind, though, this wasn't a problem. When he won at the casino, he'd have more than enough to cover that amount. But of course, that's not what happened. And this is why Russell was so distraught that night when he and Jeff went to Evansville. He knew that he now had no way to dig himself out of this hole he was in. Once his check bounced on Monday, he'd have to explain himself. And when he did, it would completely blow up his perfect life. Investigators theorized that to stop this from happening, Russell went back to his aunt's place on the evening of January 12th to try and convince her not to cash his check. When Ann wouldn't do what he wanted, they argued, and Russell flew into a violent rage. After savagely ambushing and killing Ann, he partially cleaned up and fled the scene, though not before making sure to take his check with him. There were several additional details that seemed to line up with this theory. Russell knew his aunt's schedule, so he would have known when Ann got home from church that evening. An unannounced visit also wouldn't have been unexpected as far as Ann was concerned. She would have let Russell in willingly, and because she was close to him, would have felt comfortable enough not wearing her wig. There's one more thing I haven't mentioned yet, and while it's minor, it also stuck out as important to police. Russell Winstead owned and drove a black pickup truck, one that matched the description from those witnesses. Of course, even with all of this, there was still the matter of Russell's alibi. Remember, his wife Terry had previously backed up everything he'd said about being home during the time frame when Ann was killed. Well, as it happened, Terry changed her tune pretty quickly once she found out the truth about her husband.
Russell's gambling. What's your idea of how much he takes?
We just didn't discuss it.
Well, Terry, prepare yourself a little bit. Russell had a bad gambling habit. This is how much money since 2000 got chips for. You ready? 1.6 million. When Russell loses, he's lost anywhere from $10,000 to $40,000 in a night. Segment. Liquid and tissues.
As you just heard, Terry kind of had a sense that Russell liked to play blackjack, but she had no idea about the extent of his gambling. Given Russell's burner phone, I think it's fair to say she also had no idea about the womanizing. And though she left that initial interview too emotional to really say anything else, it wasn't long before Terry came back with both a lawyer and a new statement for police.
What did you tell officers the first time you talked to them?
I told them that you and her on 2028. That's what happened.
Who told you to say that? You tell me exactly what you're saying?
After confessing to helping fabricate Russell's alibi, Terry gave detectives some other useful information. She admitted that he hadn't come home until after 9 p.m. on January 12th, meaning he would have had more than enough time to commit the murder, partially clean up, and come back like nothing had happened. It seemed that the only thing left to do now was charge Russell with Ann's murder. But as I told you from the very beginning of this video, nothing about this story is straightforward. Because when authorities actually moved in to arrest Russell, he was gone. And little did detectives know, this wasn't even the last twist they would encounter in this case. It probably goes without saying, but criminal investigations take time, especially ones as complex as this. And by the time detectives had enough to arrest Russell Winstead, 6 months had passed since Ann Branson's death. In July of 2003, he was officially indicted for murder and first-degree robbery in connection with the case. Unfortunately, the announcement wasn't much of a relief, because it came with a pretty big footnote, which is that police didn't actually know where Russell was. And as authorities soon admitted, this was the worst-case scenario too, because Russell hadn't just fled the area or even the state, he'd fled the country. Russell had secretly traveled to Chicago and obtained a passport a couple of months earlier, after he realized that his wife wasn't going to lie for him anymore. Sorry, ex-wife. Yeah, as soon as Terry found out that her husband was a serial cheater and gambling addict who'd brought their family to the brink of financial ruin, she filed for divorce. Anyway, this was obviously a big problem for investigators, because now they had to conduct an international manhunt. Russell was added to the National Crime Information Center's list of fugitives, and a notice was also given to Interpol. As I'm sure you can imagine, this all caused quite the media circus, and the case quickly became a national news story. And that interest only grew after the next major development was announced 3 months later. In early October of 2003, investigators with the Kentucky State Police announced that they were almost certain Russell Winstead was hiding in Costa Rica. How did they know that? Well, they had just arrested his father, Earl, who was now accused of helping to support Russell while he was on the run. Specifically, Earl was charged with 7 counts of conspiracy and first-degree hindering prosecution for sending his son thousands of dollars worth of wire transfers. This is even worse than it sounds, because authorities believed that Earl had actually been helping Russell long before this. In fact, they suspected that he'd likely known about what was going on since the very beginning. There were several reasons for that, starting with the fact that, if you recall, Earl was the one who actually found Ann's body in the basement and was the person who let police into the house. Police likewise learned during their conversations with Terry that Russell had only come up with the plan about the fake alibi after speaking to his father. Oh yeah, and remember our old pal Judy Harvey, the cleaning lady who kept lying to police? Well, that also made a lot more sense when detectives found out that she was very close with Earl Winstead. Authorities strongly suspected Earl had paid or somehow convinced Judy to lie about Wayne Shelton and Robert Prince to throw the investigation off course. Now, I should say, investigators could never prove anything but the wire transfers, so officially the rest of this is all speculation. But if true, it's incredibly chilling to think that Earl knew the truth about his sister's death and not only allegedly worked to conceal it, but allowed his family to actively comfort him while he knew his son was the killer. There's one final gut punch to all of this too, because it turned out that that money that Earl was wiring to Russell, it was from the payout he received from Ann's estate. In other words, he was giving the victim's money to her killer. Earl ultimately took a plea bargain on the 7 charges and, as part of the deal, managed to stay out of jail by getting a suspended sentence. As much as this was a breakthrough, unfortunately, authorities were still at something of a dead end. The wire transfers had been set up in a decently elaborate way, so while they knew Russell was in Costa Rica, they didn't know where in the country he actually was. And there was another issue too. You see, because of the seriousness of Ann Branson's murder, Russell was eligible for the death penalty if convicted. And because of Costa Rica's extradition policies, even if authorities found Russell, they would not send him back to the United States as long as he was facing a potential death sentence. Deciding to handle one problem at a time, investigators focused on the search effort, and it was here that they received some much welcomed assistance. That help came from the television show America's Most Wanted, who profiled the Ann Branson case and eventually added Russell to their Dirty Dozen list. It took some time, but in May of 2005, so nearly 2 years after Russell went on the run, he was located and captured in the capital of San Jose. He was arrested, and I'm not making this up, as he was walking out of the Horseshoe Casino. So yeah, he was still gambling. In fact, most of Russell's time on the run had been very comfortable for him from the sounds of it. Newspaper reports from the time state that he was able to find a place in an affluent gated community popular with tourists and was living under the name Jeffrey Danfish, courtesy of a stolen passport. As I touched on before, even after Russell's arrest, it took several more months of legal wrangling to actually get him extradited, and was only once prosecutors in Kentucky promised to take the death penalty off the table completely that he was finally put on a plane back to the United States in February of 2006. Even so, you'd think that with Russell back on US soil, things would be smooth sailing from here on out. But, and I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, nothing about this case is straightforward. You see, despite everything that had happened up until now, Russell still maintained his innocence. In fact, he went as far as to claim that he wasn't fleeing the country when he went to Costa Rica. He was simply on vacation. In the lead up to his trial, he and his defense team came out even harder, accusing law enforcement of railroading him and trying to frame an innocent man because they couldn't find Ann Branson's real killer. Now, this might sound silly, particularly the part about Russell being on vacation, but there were parts of this that prosecutors took seriously. As we've already discussed, there was no physical evidence tying Russell to the murder, and authorities were also aware that some of their witness statements were more than a little shaky. For instance, one of the people who claimed to see the black pickup truck outside Ann's house on the night of the murder also eventually came forward and provided a description of a man she claimed she'd seen near the vehicle. She later claimed this man was Russell Winstead, though her initial description did not really match Russell's appearance at all. I didn't bring this up before, but there were also cigarette butts recovered in the vicinity of Ann Branson's house when police conducted their searches of the property. Russell's lawyers pointed out that he wasn't a smoker and these were never tested for DNA. None of these things necessarily meant that prosecutors were wrong, and they had explanations for all of these things. There was no physical evidence because the crime scene had been partially cleaned up. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, and those cigarette butts may have been outside of Ann's house, but she lived on the town's main road, and there wasn't anything clearly linking them to her murder, which is why they hadn't tested them. But there was one thing that legitimately made them question whether they'd gotten this entire investigation wrong from the very beginning. It happened when they started receiving letters from a man named Fred Roulette. Those letters essentially said, "I know Russell Winstead is innocent because I am the one that actually killed Ann Branson." Of course, this was a huge claim, but Fred Roulette offered pretty convincing proof. Included in his letters were very accurate diagrams of Ann's basement and the crime scene, complete with details only the killer could have known. That included the murder weapon, which Fred stated was a modified Bradis hammer, specifically a hammer that had a blunt end on one side and a sharp end on the other, which finally seemed to explain the two very different kinds of injuries Ann had suffered. That wasn't all, though. You see, Fred Roulette was writing his confession letters from jail. In August of 2005, he'd killed a woman named Billy Cochran. Billy had some obvious similarities to Ann Branson. She was an elderly woman who lived alone and who was brutally murdered after being stabbed when Fred managed to get into her home. Understandably, when investigators received Fred's letters, they were shaken. They started to doubt themselves and wonder, have we messed up big time here? However, that's when the case took its final and arguably most incredible turn. While looking further into Fred Roulette, detectives learned that he'd briefly been held in the Hopkins County Jail. I'll give you one guess as to who his cellmate was while he was there. Yeah, it was Russell Winstead. Realizing this, detectives went and interviewed Fred, but they did this in a clever way. They told him, just so you know, taking the death penalty off the table, that was just so we could extradite Russell. That protection does not apply to you. If you're confessing to this, we're going to go back to prosecuting this as a capital punishment case. Unsurprisingly, after hearing this, Fred completely changed his tune. He admitted that he'd been bribed into confessing by Russell, who'd offered him all sorts of things, including large amounts of commissary money and trust fund accounts for each of his kids. Fred said he knew he was probably going away for life anyway for killing Billy Cochran, so it seemed like a good deal. But he wasn't willing to die for Russell Winstead. Fred explained that Russell had walked him through everything he'd included in his false confession letters and had shown him how to draw the diagrams of the crime scene and coached him on what details to include. The murder weapon made even more sense with this revelation, because the Bradis hammer was a type of hammer that Russell would have used in his job at the coal mine. With Fred's information, as well as his agreement to testify against Russell, authorities were once again confident in their case. And in the summer of 2007, Russell Winstead finally went on trial for the murder of Anna Mae Branson. During the proceedings, the defense tried everything they could think of to discredit the case. They brought up all of the stuff I mentioned before, argued that the whole thing was circumstantial, and brought their own witnesses to try and bolster Russell's claims of innocence. Judy Harvey even came back for a final appearance, in which she now tried to attack the timeline of the case, claiming that Anne had called her at 9 p.m. on the night of January 12th after she was already supposed to be dead. Of course, in true Judy fashion, apparently no evidence in her phone records actually backed this up. In general, it seems prosecutors came prepared for whatever the defense threw at them, particularly when it came to their witnesses. They had Russell's ex-wife Terry, they had his work friend Jeff Hibbs, and they even had a new witness who further disputed Russell's character as a so-called kind-hearted Christian family man. That witness was a woman who Russell had lived with during his time in Costa Rica. She testified that not only had Russell borrowed tons of money from her, which he had never paid back, when she demanded repayment, she claimed Russell repeatedly hit her and threatened to kill her and her family if she went to the police. If you think about it, the trial was sort of poetic in its own way. One by one, all of the people who Russell had lied to and screwed over were able to play a part in his downfall. The star of the show, though, was Fred Roulette, who explained how he'd agreed to take the blame in exchange for money. And let's just say, it was pretty convincing when he started rattling off details about Anne's murder that he said he'd been given by Russell and that only the killer would have known. In the end, Russell Winstead was convicted of both murder and first-degree robbery in connection with the killing of Anne Branson. Just as an aside, because I don't think I explicitly said this earlier, the robbery charge was for Russell stealing the check back from Anne's house, because once he gave it to her, it was legally her property. Anyway, because the death penalty was not an option, Russell was sentenced to life with parole after 25 years. According to the most up-to-date information we could find, he currently remains at the Little Sandy Correctional Complex in Sandy Hook, Kentucky. His earliest possible release date is in April of 2030. There is so much I could say about this case because, let's be honest, this was an absolutely wild one. But I think we've once again broken our record for longest video here, so I'll try and keep this short. One of the craziest things to me about this story is how Russell kept doubling down on his schemes to avoid responsibility, even well after it was clear to police that he was the person responsible for this. I mean, I suppose he was a gambler, so that makes sense, which incidentally is why we chose to call this story Double Down. You know, like how you can double down on a hand of blackjack. Get it? Get it? You get it. Anyway, while Russell's plan might not have worked on investigators, it does seem that it worked on members of his family. In our research, we learned that there are quite a few people who still support him and believe he is innocent. And based on some semi-recent interviews, it seems Russell very much continues to maintain he was wrongfully convicted. Another thing that's upsetting about this case is that it wasn't just Anne Branson and her family who were affected by what happened. I touched on this briefly before when I talked about all of the finger-pointing and accusations flying around Madisonville. But what I didn't tell you is that Wayne Shelton actually passed away just a few months after he was interviewed by police. Because of the timing, members of Wayne's family partially blame the stress of the investigation and him being looked at as a suspect for his death. Of course, the biggest victim in all of this was undoubtedly Anne, who suffered an absolutely horrific fate. One that was not only completely undeserved, but in a tragic twist of irony, happened because she tried to help someone she loved. Anne worked hard for everything she had, and while she might have been in her twilight years, her death isn't any less of a tragedy. That being said, I think to only see the tragedy in all of this is to entirely miss the point of Anne's incredible life. To that end, I want to finish off with something that stuck with me that we came across in our research for this story. It's part of an opinion piece that ran in a local newspaper just days after Anne's murder. It reads, quote, "In the years to come, we will never fully understand why this happened. We can instead dwell on the many good things Anne Branson stood for in her life. We can grow and learn a lot more from the way she lived than from the way she died." Hey there. Before you take off, we'd just like to take a second and say that we really appreciate you sticking around to the end of the video. Luke and I are so grateful for our incredible Crime Zone community, so thank you for being a part of it. If you want to help Crime Zone continue to grow, one of the easiest things you can do is leave a like on this video and consider subscribing. Be sure to hit that notification bell as well and select all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, there are a couple of options. We've got a thriving community over on Patreon, where you can get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. Head over to patreon.com/crimezone to learn more and to meet some of the awesome people whose names are currently on screen. If that isn't your thing, we've also now launched channel memberships so you can join directly here on YouTube. Channel members get a lot of the same perks as on Patreon, including extra content, without the added hassle of having to go off-platform. Now, that being said, we know times are tough and that not everyone is able to support financially. Regardless of your situation though, we want you to know that we truly appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much, and we hope to see you soon.